So picking up the next question from object-oriented programming questions and answers video series, what is an interface and what's the difference between abstract classes and interfaces? Now what we'll do in this video is that we'll first define an interface. We'll see that how interfaces helps us to achieve decoupling in a project and how does it helps us to bring uniformity throughout the classes. And then finally we'll end this video by understanding the differences between abstract classes and interfaces. So let's first try to understand, or let's first try to define what an interface is. An interface, it's basically a class, but it has no implementation. In other words, it has empty events, methods, and properties. So here's an interface I've defined called as iDatabase. In order to define an interface in C#, you need to use the interface keyword. So here's a simple interface I've defined called as iDatabase, which has an empty method called as update. Now, if you want to use this interface in any of the classes, you need to inherit this interface. In other words, you need to implement this interface, and then you need to define your implementation inside the concrete classes. Define your implementation. So here's where you will define implementation. At this moment, I have not defined any implementation for update, so it's empty currently. But yes, you can write your EDO connections here. You can write your your command object, fire stored procedures, etc. So in order to define an interface, you will use the interface keyword, and any methods, properties, or events inside the interface are defined empty. And later, this interface is inherited and implemented in the child classes. Now, the question which will pop up in your mind is, so what good are these empty methods? I mean to say, a class with empty methods, how good they are and what's the use of it? Now, there are two big advantages of interfaces or the empty methods. The first big advantage is standardization of vocabulary, and the second advantage of interface or these empty methods is decoupling. So let's first try to understand that how does interface helps us to enforce standardization of vocabulary across classes. So let's go to the code. We have two classes over here on the code snippet which you see on the video. One is the CLS customer and the other one is CLS supplier. Now let's say that CLS customer is been given to Mr. X. A developer called as Mr. X is going to develop CLS customer, and a developer called as Mr. Y is going to develop CLS supplier. Now Mr. X, in order to add this CLS customer record to the database, he creates a function or a method called as update to database. While Mr. Y, he creates a method called as add to database. Now both of these methods, they are doing the same thing. They are adding a class to a database, or they are adding the class values to a database. But still, the method names are not unique, or they are not uniform. So, if let's say that tomorrow you have like 50 or 60 classes and they are being coded by different developers, which is very much possible, everybody will be having his own naming convention. So the uniformity of your class is completely lost, or the uniformity throughout your project is completely lost. And that's where interfaces helps us. So let's say that you tell to Mr. X and Mr. Y that please go and implement the iDatabase interface. Now the time they implement the iDatabase interface, the interface basically applies a strong rule on the classes saying that you have to name your database method as update. So in this way, both customer and supplier will have only one naming convention, and that is update. So let's try to see that how iDatabase helps us to bring uniformity in both of these classes. So here's the modified code, and I have here the CLS customer and CLS supplier class which is implementing or inheriting the iDatabase interface. So you can see this, the iDatabase interface is now implemented by CLS customer class as well as CLS supplier class. Now let's say that even though the interface is implemented, the developers are still not adhering to the naming terminology. They are still pursuing with their own naming terminology as discussed previously. Even if they do that, and if they try to compile this project, they will be thrown up error saying that please do implement update method and not the add to database and update to database. So you can see that over here error is popped up saying that CLS customer does not implement update and CLS supplier does not implement update. So right at the build time it will give an error. So now the developers are forced to use the update method. So let's define this as update and let's define this as update. So once we do that, and if we compile the build, you can see that the errors are all gone off. So in this way, both your developers, Mr. X and Mr. Y, are forced to name their method, the database method, as update. And with this, we bring a complete uniformity across project. So probably as a senior person or as an architect, what you can do is that you can define your interface and then tell every of your developers saying that this is the interface for database, this is the interface for business objects, this is the interface for the UI. So with this, what will happen is that there is a complete uniformity of naming convention across your project. The second big advantage of using interfaces is decoupling. A good software design is that design which separates one system from the other system, so that when you make changes to one system, it doesn't affect the other system. So decoupling is a very important concept in terms of designing or in terms of a software architecture design. And interfaces helps you to achieve decoupling. So let's say that you have an accounts class and let's say that you have an invoice class. And the invoice class has to communicate with the accounts class. Now, rather than connecting directly from classes to classes, or rather than connecting directly both of these concrete classes, what you can do is that you can put an interface in between and both of these classes talk via the interface. So interface decouples both these classes by acting as a third man in between. So this is a very important concept, or this is a very important advantage by interfaces, and that is decoupling. Remember that there are many design patterns which talks about how you decouple a UI from the business objects, from the business objects to the dial component, and there are so many design patterns. But if you really see, all of these design patterns internally use interface for decoupling. Interface is a very important concept in object-oriented programming. So any design pattern, any good architecture you design, if it doesn't have interfaces, that means it doesn't have a decoupled system. So let's try to understand that how we can achieve decoupling in C#. So what we'll do is that we'll take up a simple example and we'll try to see that how interface helps us to decouple two classes. So here's a simple example which demonstrates how interface can help us to achieve decouplement. So here's a class called as CLS customer object, which basically validates a customer data. And then we have two database classes here, CLS SQL Server as well as CLS Oracle. Now both of these classes are implementing the IDB interface. So CLS SQL Server class basically does, helps us to do insert, update and delete operations with SQL Server database, while CLS Oracle class helps us to do insert, update and delete operations on the Oracle database. Now CLS customer object wants to use the CLS Oracle or the CLS SQL Server class to do insert, update and delete. Now what we want is that we do not want CLS customer object to directly talk with both of these classes. So that tomorrow if I want, I can add a new class here called as CLS MySQL, but I don't need to change anything in my CLS customer object. So that's, so in other words, we have to decouple CLS customer object from the concrete database classes. So that's our need currently. So what we have done over here is that we have defined an interface called as IDB, and we have implemented that interface in both of these classes. Now whenever CLS customer object wants to call the update method of SQL Server or Oracle, he needs to reference the interface. So the time he references the interface, he is only referencing to this interface. He is not referencing to the concrete classes. So with this we are achieving a decouplement, because now your CLS customer object is not creating any object of CLS SQL Server or CLS Oracle within himself. It's only referencing the IDB interface. And if you want, by an external class, you can inject this IDB, you can inject the CLS SQL Server or Oracle class in the update method. So the CLS customer object now is completely decoupled from both of these classes. So tomorrow if I want, I can add a new class here called as CLS MySQL, and I do not need to change anything in the CLS customer object. Why? Because the CLS customer object is using the interface. So in this way, interface helps us to decouple two classes from each other, and by doing decouplement, we achieve, by doing decouplement, when any change is made into one system, it doesn't affect the other system. When we started this video, the interface video, we had discussed that this video will be covering the basics of interfaces, then we'll talk about the advantages of interfaces, and finally we will end the video by talking about the differences between abstract classes and interfaces. The video is becoming quite big, so what I'm doing is that I am breaking this video into two parts, part 1 and part 2. So the part 1 of the video is the video which we are viewing currently. So there is a part 2 of the video also available for the same. So in part 2 of the video, what we'll do is that we will talk about some basic concepts about interfaces which we have still not discussed, and you can see those bullet points on the video at this moment. and finally we will talk about the differences between abstract classes and interfaces. So please do have a look at the part 2 of this video.